We good to go? Okay. Welcome, everyone. On behalf of the leadership and staff here at the English US, I would like to welcome everyone as we host the most recent release of the Joint Center's America's Rental Housing Report. My name is Lot Diaz. I'm Vice President for Housing and Financial Empowerment here at Unidos US. Unidos, for those who aren't aware of our organization that much, we are the largest civil rights and advocacy organization focused on Latino issues in the nation, whose mission is to build a stronger America, creating opportunities for Latinos nationally. We seek to change the systems of underlying causes and economic and social inequities for Latinos and build power and representation in the community to influence and hold systems accountable going forward. We do this through our unique combination of policy, advocacy, and program work, as well as we have a network of nearly 300 organizations across the United States and Puerto Rico. Housing is not always the first civil rights issue that comes to mind for many, but it should be. Poverty and discrimination based on race, ethnicity, language, proficiency, immigration status are endemic in many parts of our society and even more amplified in the housing market. Our organization has been engaged in housing issues since the mid-'80s and has contributed solutions through collaborative policy work in housing and poverty alleviation by developing one of the largest housing counseling networks in the country, assisting over 70,000 families a year, and helping them identify solutions to their housing needs. We and created a CDFI, the Rasa Development Fund, now the largest Latino-focused CDFI in the country, and for which housing investments is a critical part of the $1 billion it has invested since 2000 around the country. And just this past June, we launched our home ownership means equity initiative, which is a long-term commitment to growing Latino home ownership in this nation going forward again. Housing is part of the civil rights story, and limited opportunities to obtain affordable rental housing disadvantages all Americans. But I want to close and to begin the program by saying that access to affordable housing is out of reach, as our sister agency, National Low Income Housing Coalition, reminds us regularly. This is true for all low and moderate income, could you say all Americans, but particularly low and moderate income people. And for the Latino community, you had the added additional barriers of immigration status, language proficiency, and its underrepresentation in HUD's housing programs. It is an issue that impacts families' lives pervasively, where they work, the quality access to quality food and services, and whether they're safe from both crime and environmental issues. Joint deepens our understanding and helps inform policy and practice. Thanks again and welcome. And with that, I'm going to introduce Herbert, the Managing Director for Harvard Joint Center.
Good afternoon, everyone. As Lot said, I'm Chris Herbert. I'm the Managing Director of the Joint Center for Housing Studies at Harvard, and I'm really pleased to be with you today to release America's Rental Housing 2024. We've been publishing this report every other year since 2006, and we did that in order to shine a light on the importance of good quality, affordable housing for the 45 million American households who call rental housing home. As you'll hear, this year's report captures a difficult year for the U.S. rental market. To begin with, for property owners facing challenging conditions with operating costs rising, interest rates rising, making it very difficult financially to provide that housing. But more importantly, it's a year of several disturbing records. A record number of renters are having rental housing that they can't afford, a record number of people living on the streets without a roof over their head. It's a very challenging situation. We hope that this report and the discussions you'll hear this afternoon will both bring much needed attention to these issues, but more importantly, also help spur action by the public, the nonprofit, and the public sectors to help address these challenges. But before turning to today's presentations, there are a few people and organizations I want to thank. First, I have to thank Wells Fargo, who provided the funding for this report, who was really foundational in making this report possible. So thank you, Wells. Secondly, I want to thank our colleagues at Unidos US for helping to open their doors and sharing this beautiful space with us. It's wonderful to have you as a partner in this effort. While the report is the work of the Joint Center staff, we're actually supporting this effort by a group of a dozen organizations from across the housing sector, focusing on the housing industry and the housing advocacy. Those organizations are listed on our website. They help shape both the subjects and the framing of the report, and also help read it to make sure that what we present is fair, accurate, and honest from a variety of points of view. So our many thanks to that group for helping the quality of the report. And finally, a big thank you to my colleague, Whitney Ergodabricki, who led this year's report, who you'll hear from shortly, to Sophia Wadeen, who is also a principal researcher on this report, and frankly, to all of the staff of the Joint Center and to the research communications and administration of the center, who all contribute mightily to this report. So I'm indebted to them for the hard work they put together. So with that, and without further ado, let me turn it over to Whitney Ergodabricki to share some highlights from this year's report. Whitney.
Good afternoon. I'm so excited to be able to share the findings of America's Rental Housing 2024 with you today. I'd just like to first start by thanking you all for being here, both in person and online. Thank you to the entire JCHS team. As Chris mentioned, I think everybody has a hand in making this report possible. And thank you as well again to Wells Fargo for the funding that also made this report possible. When we last wrote this report 2 years ago, rental demand was surging and markets were overheating. Now it's a very different situation. Rental markets are softening, but affordability conditions are worse than ever before. Housing instability, including evictions and homelessness, is also rising as pandemic relief measures have ended. Meanwhile, the long-term shortfall in rental assistance has only worsened, leaving a record high number of income-eligible renters without any assistance. But affordability is, of course, not the only problem facing rental markets today. The rental stock has significant investment needs that may be increasingly challenging to meet as property owners are facing increased costs and slowing returns. And the high interest rate environment is also putting a damper on rental market activity. So I'm going to go through each of these in a little bit more detail, and we'll start first with the softening rental market. A big indicator that rental markets are cooling is stalled out rent growth. In the third quarter of 2023, rents in professionally managed apartments grew by just 0.4%. If you look at the chart here, that shaded gray area is the rent growth for all apartments. This was a significant turnaround from the peak you can see about early 2022 there, when rents were growing by just over 15%. Cooling was consistent across property classes, with lower, mid, and high quality apartments all posting growth rates in the third quarter of less than 1%. But what explains this rapid deceleration? Rising vacancy rates are certainly a piece of the puzzle. This chart is again showing data for the professionally managed apartment sector. And in the third quarter of 2023, 5.5% of these units were vacant, which put the rate above pre-pandemic averages and about double the all-time low of 2.5% set in early 2022. Strong multifamily completions have helped push those vacancy rates up. Completed units on this chart are shown in the light blue line at the bottom. On a seasonally adjusted annualized basis, 436,000 multifamily units were completed in the third quarter of 2023, which was nearly a third over pre-pandemic levels. And it might be a little hard to see from all the lines on this chart, but that's one of the strongest completions numbers in about 3 decades. So units are hitting the ground at a pretty high level right now, and there's a record high number of units under construction, which is shown on the chart in that dark blue line that you can see just soaring at the top. I'll also talk about it more later, but I just want to draw your attention quickly to that orange line, which are the starts. You can see clear to the right, there's that slight downward notch where we've started to see multifamily construction cool a little bit. Stabilizing demand after a massive surge has also given supply a chance to catch up. This chart is the year-over-year net change in households living in professionally managed apartments. In this sector, growing demand peaked in the first quarter of 2022 with the addition of more than 700,000 households. before plunging to a net loss by the fourth quarter of that year. You can see the return in demand then in the third quarter of 2023 here. Now this is year over year. What's not shown are the quarterly increases, the quarter over quarter increases. And those show that 91,000 new households formed in the third quarter alone, which put that growth on par with what we'd seen pre-pandemic. Despite recent market cooling, rents do remain well above pre-pandemic levels, which is creating challenging conditions for affordability. In fact, at last count, which was in 2022, the number of cost-burdened renter households who spend more than 30% of their incomes on rent and utilities hit a record high of 22.4 million, an increase of more than 2 million households since 2019. Severely burdened renters who spend more than half of their incomes on rent and utilities also hit a record high of 12.1 million. That's shown on that far right dark blue bar there, and that was up from 10.5 million before the pandemic. As a result of these increases, half of all renters are now cost burdened. That share is that top light blue line. That was an increase of more than 3 percentage points since the start of the pandemic and 9 percentage points since 2001. The magnitude of increasing cost burdens during the pandemic has been astounding, but it's also notable that we've been seeing these increases across every single income group since 2019 and an acceleration of a longer term trend. The fastest increases were among middle income households. Right in the middle of this chart, you see that group that makes $45,000 to $75,000. They saw their burden rate since 2019 increase by more than 5 percentage points just in those 3 years alone. It was especially startling, though, that the lowest income households, who are shown clear to the left, these are households who make less than $30,000, also saw their burden rate increase 1.5 percentage points during the pandemic from already persistently high levels. The cost burden rate for these renters then reached a new high of 83%. The upward shift in the rent distribution has contributed to these rising cost burdens up the income scale. Since 2012, the country has lost 2.1 million units renting for less than $600 and 4 million units renting for $600 to $1,000. Rising rents and also new construction that's targeted at the high end of the market have resulted in an increase of 8.4 million units renting for more than $1,400, which is a level that's out of reach for the majority of renters. Rents have risen faster than incomes over the longer term, leaving renters with less left over each month after paying rent. We refer to this as the residual income. The median residual income for all renters was 4% lower in 2022 than it was in 2001 when adjusting for inflation. That median, though, significantly masks the inequality that exists. Lower income households, who are shown on this orange line, make less than $30,000 a year, have seen their median residual income drop by a full 47% since 2001 to an all-time low of just $310 per month. This historically high level of unaffordability, coupled with the end of pandemic supports and protections for renters, has led to the rising incidence of housing instability. After the expiration of eviction moratoriums and with the spending down of the $46.5 billion emergency rental assistance program, evictions neared pre-pandemic levels by the end of 2022, and they've remained high since then. About 12% of all renters were behind on rent in the middle of last year, including about a fifth of lower income households. And because of longstanding discrimination in housing and employment, households headed by a Black person were also disproportionately likely to be at risk of eviction. The number of people experiencing homelessness also hit a record high of 653,000 people in January 2023. As we mentioned, renter protections, income supports, and increased housing assistance helped stave off a considerable rise in homelessness early in the pandemic, but many of those supports were gone by 2022 when rents were rising rapidly. This resulted in the largest single-year jump in the number of people experiencing homelessness, with 71,000 people. And included in that increase were an additional 23,000 people staying in places not intended for human habitation, which pushed the unsheltered population to an all-time high of more than 256,000 people. This trend further exacerbated the longer-term rise in unsheltered homelessness that communities across the country have been seeing. Since 2015, the unsheltered population nationally has increased by 48%. And while the number of people experiencing unsheltered homelessness grew quickly in expensive states like California, Washington, and Oregon, states that were traditionally more affordable have also recorded large increases, including Arizona, Ohio, Tennessee, and Texas. Even as unaffordability and housing instability have worsened, though, rental assistance has not expanded to meet the growing need. Just 1 in 4 income-eligible renters actually receives assistance, and the consequences of not receiving assistance have only grown more dire. This chart is showing very low-income households. These are households who make no more than 50% of area median income. The orange bars are those who receive assistance, and the stacked bars are those who are income eligible but go without assistance. The number of very low-income households rose by 4.4 million from 2001 to 2021, but the number of assisted households increased by just 910,000. This left 14 million households without assistance. And you can see from that dark blue bar clear to the right that 8.5 million of these households had worst-case housing needs, meaning that they spent more than half of their income on housing or lived in severely inadequate conditions. As a result, 60% of unassisted households had worst-case needs in 2021, which was up from 47% in 2001. And the need for expanded and improved rental assistance programs remains as critical as ever. Affordability and the shortfall in assistance are not the only challenges facing rental housing right now. The rental stock is older than it has ever been before and has significant investment needs. Although building construction standards and repairs to existing units have helped to minimize the problem of structural inadequacy, nearly 4 million rental units fall short of basic habitability. On the chart, you can see that while about 8% of all renters live in these conditions, lower income, Black, and Hispanic people are disproportionately exposed to housing inadequacy. Even units that meet the criteria for physical adequacy still have significant unmet repair needs. The Federal Reserve Bank of Philadelphia estimated that it would cost more than $51 billion to address the repair needs of the occupied rental stock alone. And this, of course, does not even account for the growing need for accessible features that our rapidly aging population also has. The rental stock further needs upgrades to reduce its contribution to greenhouse gas emissions. Extreme weather variability and rising temperatures caused by climate change are expected to increase home energy demand and in turn renters' housing costs. Already about half of renters who make less than $30,000 experience energy insecurity. Those two left bars on the chart add up to a full 8.4 million lower income households that forego basic necessities to pay an energy bill, maintain an unhealthy temperature in their home, or have received a disconnection notice. The Inflation Reduction Act recently did include about $9 billion in household rebates and tax credits and provided an additional $1 billion for water and energy efficiency improvements, specifically in HUD-assisted housing. Improvements will also be needed to adapt to the growing threat of climate change. About 18 million units, amounting to 41% of the occupied rental stock, are located in areas that, according to FEMA, have at least moderate economic losses from hazards like earthquakes, hurricanes, and flooding. On the map here, you can see those darkest blue areas where these units are especially concentrated, but really this is a pretty geographically widespread problem. While much of federal policy focuses on helping households and communities recover after disasters, investment in pre-disaster upgrades will be increasingly necessary to help property owners and communities make their rental stock more resilient to extreme events. Now, making all of these needed improvements in a way that also preserves affordability will be increasingly challenging for property owners, as costs such as insurance are increasing and those returns are slowing. So while current property owners likely face some tough months ahead, the high interest rate environment that we've seen over the last year or so has also increased the cost of debt to acquire and build multifamily properties. High treasury yields have also increased the cost of equity as investors expect greater returns from apartments to compete with other relatively low risk investments. This is then making it harder for deals to pencil out, which has slowed the demand for multifamily loans and contributed to a drop in apartment transaction volume and to the first drop in apartment property prices that we'd seen since 2010. Perhaps most significant, though, has been the slowing of multifamily construction, which I alluded to earlier. Multifamily starts climbed during the pandemic. You can see on that smoothed dark blue line, it's trending upward through 2022. And even into 2023, starts remained at some of the highest levels the country had seen in the last 20 years, with a seasonally adjusted annual rate of 571,000 units started in May. Market cooling and the high cost of financing contributed to the sharp slowdown in starts, and by October, starts were down 30% year over year. We still do have that robust pipeline of multifamily units under construction, but declining starts could worsen the existing supply shortage. More places are trying to make it easier to build multifamily homes, like including several states that have preempted local zoning in recent years to allow a range of housing options on land that was previously zoned exclusively for single-family homes. But especially when we consider the current context of market forces that are slowing construction, greater policy efforts are going to be needed, are going to be crucial for meeting the deep affordability needs that exist across the country. With that, I'd like to just thank you again for joining us today. I hope that everyone will visit our website and download the report. We also have a lot of data and interactive tools available if you want to see what's going on in your state or your community. So I hope everyone can make good use of those. And with that, I'd now like to introduce our panel moderator, Robbie Sequeira, who is a staff writer for Stateline. And I'd also like to welcome our panelists to the stage. Thank you.
Hey everybody, thank you for joining us today. I'm Robbie Sequeira, I'm a staff writer at Stateline, covering housing. I'm excited here to dig into this report, which I know personally for me has helped a lot with my stories. These people here, this beautiful panelist of people here have a unique and valuable perspective into this report, and I will introduce them. Next to me is Chris Herbert. He is the managing director of the Joint Center of Housing Studies, the research center at Harvard that produced the report we're talking about today. Ethan Handelman is the Deputy Assistant Secretary for Multifamily at the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development, aka HUD. Jacqueline Wagner is the President of Solutions Division of Enterprise Community Partners. And Pete Canova is the Head of Multifamily Capital at Wells Fargo. Thank you all for being here. And a quick reminder for those of you watching online that you can join the conversation on Twitter or X with hashtag Harvard Housing Report. Chris, let me direct my first question to you. We heard in Whitney's presentation that one of the biggest takeaways is the staggering number of renters who are now cost burdened in the United States. That it's tipped to half of all renters. What's driving this? And are cooling rental market conditions and the huge influx in supply going to help in any real tangible way?
What's fundamentally driving this is supply and demand, and we have had a long period of time where we just haven't been building enough housing, and that's led to a situation where rents have been rising faster than inflation. You go back in Whitney's charts, looking back over the last 10 or 12 years, the rate of inflation didn't look abnormally high, in part because of how crazy high it was the last couple of years. But over the last decade, we've seen a continual increase in rents. Then we met the pandemic, and the pandemic had a spike in demand, and people suddenly demanded more space, not just to live, but also to work from home. And rental households split up into multiple housing units, and we saw that incredible spike in demand. And housing supply doesn't respond that quickly. And so when you have that much demand coming in and that fixed supply, rents went up that 15%. At the same time, you also have to think about the cost side, right? And so what happened during the pandemic? The cost of lumber, the cost of appliances, windows and doors, that all went up. Land prices have been going up. So that's a big piece of the story. So now we're saying, okay, well, we're getting all that supply coming online, rents are slowing. Is that going to help solve the problem? In part, I guess the way I would frame it is it's going to keep the problem from getting worse, right? So what Whitney showed is that rents are now slowing to a low rate of growth, close to zero. So that means that those rent levels we achieved during the pandemic aren't getting worse, but they're also not falling. And so over time, we'll see some easing of the problem as we have incomes hopefully outpacing those rent growths. But apartments have to pencil out. And right now, apartments are having a tough time penciling out. And so we're not going to see rents fall, because what we're going to see is builders stopping building. So I think that what we see now, that supply coming online, it's helping, but it's not going to solve the problem. And I do have to always point out that when we're talking about the market rate for rental housing, there's a lot of folks making decent money. Whitney talked about the growth in upper income renters, but the report notes that there are 26% of renters make under $24,000 a year. And for them, a $600 apartment is affordable. It's hard to imagine a market in this country where anybody can build and operate an apartment for that low. So we're always going to have to talk about what do we do to get market rate housing affordable, but then what do we do about those folks where the market really can't help?
Thank you for answering that question. It's such a multi-layered issue with housing as we're going to get into.
Yeah.
Supply, Jacqueline, one of the things that helps with supply is zoning. And a few states have taken on zoning restrictions, particularly single-family zoning restrictions, in order to increase the supply and diversity of housing, ADUs, duplexes, triplexes, all these kind of middle and missing housing. The report also speaks to the limitations for low-income and BIPOC that low-income and BIPOC people face about where they choose to live, mainly due to land and use policies that discriminate and leave people of color behind. What can be done to advance state and local policy around zoning and land use, particularly restrictive and exclusionary policies?
Well, first of all, we need resources to match the need. I'll say that. We're not going to get out of the housing challenge without that. And as we look at what's happening with land use policies and practices and the histories of them, they were designed to leave people of color behind. So the data that you see in the report is exactly what was intended to happen. And as we look ahead to build more housing and communities, we need to think about zoning and design that increases production. There's a lot of discrimination that continues to happen in communities, and in single family communities in particular, where they show the data where there's about, I think, 34% housing and only 20% of it's rented in suburban areas, is that we need to do a better job of really stop concentrating poverty as we see it, as the report talks about, stop building rental deserts, and figure out how we're going to build housing that people can afford. And it may be low density, like in some of the single family areas, or we talked about accessory dwelling units when we were meeting. And then as we unlock zoning reform to build more housing people we can afford, we can think about unwinding some of the discrimination that we see, because often we look at marginalized groups and low-income families and people of color as if it's their fault, but it's kind of been designed, the land use policy. So I think there's opportunity to build and preserve housing with greater intentionality without mowing down single family areas.
Please.
No, I was just, if I could just interject an example, I think, my home state of Massachusetts, there's a new state law called the MBTA Housing Choice Law, which mandates that every community served by mass transit has to have a certain area that is made as a right to build housing at a 15 unit per acre density. It's not that dense, but it's a lot denser than a half acre single family zoning. And what I think is important about it is two things. One is the state did this, right? And is saying to the localities, not that thou can, it's that thou shall do this. And importantly, I think what it's done is it's really empowered the YIMBYs. Whereas before, when it's on a case-by-case basis and it's, are we going to promote this specific development, and the neighbors come out in opposition to it, this provided a forum for people in the communities who say, we are for more diverse forms of housing, and not necessarily capital A affordable, but as you're talking about, Jacqueline, more broader range of housing for a broader range of households. So I think, I just want to put a pin in, I think that as much as we talk about state and localities, states have a particularly important role to play here. And by making these mandates, they change the conversation in a very productive way. From a negative conversation by why shouldn't we do this, to a positive conversation is, we're going to do it, how should we do it?
Please.
I just wanted to say something about the neighborhood I live in. It's single family, small duplexes. If they've raised duplexes, it ended up as townhomes. So they've been doing a mix of design where we are increasing density, but it feels still like a single family, low density community. And I think there are strategies to do that. And when you go to the community meetings and people want to approve things, they're like, oh, you're tearing down a duplex and doing 4 townhomes. Maybe somebody can own something in the community. So I think there's really some great opportunities of how we can build and still be considerate of kind of a low density community.
Can I provide a little bit of a follow-up to that, but what's happening at the state level? In Montana, there's the Montana Miracle. This kind of revamping or reforming of single-family zoning to like duplexes and all these different types of housing, and then it got challenged in the courts. And so it seems like, there's a lot of barriers towards kind of not just the land use of these kind of restrictive single-family zoning policies, but the idea and the mindset. I mean, you mentioned the kind of positive attitudes. What else is going to kind of break through those barriers to even allow to entertain the idea on all levels, not even just kind of the state levels, but these judicial levels, to allow for this type of housing to happen?
We were talking about this behind stage a little bit. In New York, there was a law that was pushed by the governor similar to the law in Massachusetts, and it got squashed. And a big reason I think it did was because there wasn't local level support for it. And I think at the end of the day, you really need local level support to pass things, because every community is going to look and feel differently, right? Transit-oriented development, I think, is critical. Mixed income, I'm a big supporter of mixed income housing. I believe in. I think you need to subsidize the lower cost units with market rate units. Mixed use developments are also extremely important. And so, we need more tools, more resources.
I think you made a really good question, Robbie, because I think there's like dug-in forces that are going to oppose this. But, the thing I observe in Massachusetts, and I think it's been true of California too, is one thing that changes it is the fact that the issue of housing affordability is no longer a problem of just the poor. Now, I don't want to say that that's not a big problem we shouldn't worry about, but when you're now saying it's like, oh, my kid can't afford to buy a house, I want my kid to move back to this town, or
Or rent an apartment in the town.
Yes, right.
Exactly.
Right, or rent an apartment.
Rental port.
This is why we invited Ethan to be
I'm
on
here
this.
to serve. I'm here to
My
serve.
wingman. Sorry, I speak all different types
It's all
of housing.
good. It's all good.
But it's also the different phases of life, right? Yeah. So it's like, it's not just my kid renting an apartment. It's me. It's like, I want to stay in my community. I'd like to have an apartment downtown. So I think the democratization of the problem helps. I think the problem is California, it's happening. Massachusetts, it's happening. Montana, I give them credit for considering it, but in some ways the problem hasn't gotten far enough along for it to be that widespread to get the support. And like, I go out and I talk in Ohio and people are saying, wow, it's getting really unaffordable. It's like, don't become California.
Right.
Act now so you don't become California.
It's being preventative, being proactive rather than reactive to the problems. Pete, let me up a question your way. The report notes that multifamily construction, which was booming for the last few years, has finally started to slow down, in part because of higher interest rates. How is this playing out right now? What can be done on the financing side to ensure that multifamily construction keeps up with demand?
Sure. Look, clearly higher rates has impacted the equation, right? We went from basically a zero rate environment to SOFR's 538 now. So that's a significant increase in the cost of capital, but it's not just rates, right? It's also, when you think of a loan, there's a credit spread involved in a loan, right? Especially on a construction loan. At the height of the market, you saw construction loans probably somewhere in the 175 over SOFR. Construction loans now, probably in the market's 350 to 400. So it's not just the index, but it's also the credit spread. I think you also have, a pullback in the lending market, right? I think banks clearly are dealing with more capital requirements and constraints on them from Dodd-Frank. And then obviously, who knows what's going to happen with Basel III Endgame. But I think clearly there's large concern around that. There's talk that if Basel III Endgame goes through, you're talking about somewhere around 20% of capital being pulled out of the marketplace. And so, when you have that much capital being held, it costs more money to, set aside to make that loan. And so that gets passed on to the borrower. So it's not necessarily, just rates. We're going to talk a little bit about it's growing insurance premiums, right? It's really the expenditure side. If you look at a lot of the deals that we've done over the last few years, they're meeting the underwriting on the rent side. They're not meeting the underwriting on the expenditure side. And that's clearly a problem. And then, Chris, you talked about equity returns, right? When the treasury, is 4%, right? Equity returns are a lot higher now than they were when 10-year treasury was 1%. What I think is amazing is the noise. Just if you look at the year, we ended the year basically where we started the year, right around a 10-year treasury at 4%. Now there was a lot of noise in between that, including a small banking crisis and a lot of volatility in rates. But 4% rate, when you look at that over the last 70 years, is not a high rate. We were talking about my parents' first mortgage was 13% or 14%. So, I think it's really the expenditure side. How do you get these deals to pencil? If costs are so high to build and costs are so high to operate, right? How do you build good housing, right? And then it starts to become the equation of new construction versus preservation, so.
Do you think that gets factored in, talk about, obviously the idea for a lot of governors, policymakers is to build this housing, like actualize this housing, but do you think they kind of are entertaining how much of these costs you're talking about, how much of this is about the lender and the borrowers? Do you think that they're entertaining about a lot of this or talking about this enough in their housing plans?
Oh yeah, without a doubt. I mean, I talk to a lot of state housing finance agencies and mayor's offices, and they're all realizing the amount of subsidy it's taking for them to put into these projects. And the problem is that there's not much subsidy left, right? All the COVID money is gone. And so where's the subsidy going to come from to build this housing? A lot needs to be done there, right? I think it's going to help a little bit if we can get the 50% test, at least for Big A4. If we get the 50% test down to 30%, which is what's proposed in the new legislation that was bipartisan. It's nice to see legislation getting passed. I think we need more of that.
Yes.
Yes, ditto.
Yes, but obviously, we've also got a problem with volume cap, right? I don't understand why we don't give more volume cap to states. We've got more states that are volume cap constrained right now than we have ever had before. And to me, the 1986 Tax Act that was passed that implemented the private activity bond and low-income housing tax credit has been really the best tool to build capitally affordable housing. We need more legislation like that. Otherwise, we can't fix this problem, quite frankly.
Chris, I'm gonna have this question to you. Pete just mentioned bipartisan policies. In a politically diverse climate, do you feel that housing has become more of a bipartisan issue? And where are we seeing these political bridges being mended when it comes to housing policy? And maybe what areas should maybe we see more bipartisanship happen?
I think it has become more bipartisan in the sense that the crisis has become so broad. So you mentioned Montana. I mean, Montana is a redder state than Massachusetts, and yet this issue is in front and center. And so I think there's a couple of areas where I see real agreement across the aisle. We need to do more. Pete's touching on one, which is changes to the low-income housing tax credit program. For people who don't speak LIHTC, so the 50% basis has to do with the 4% credit, which comes with when you get a bond that doesn't have, the tax credits are attached to it, but you have to have 50% of the bond, the loan come from that. And so it's a technical fix to say you can spread more of that debt around and get more people qualify for that lower credit. And then raising the cap means having more credit. There's bills in Congress to change the LIHTC program to address these issues, to make it a bigger, more robust program that have bipartisan support, but people on both sides of the aisle. So it's one that has a lot of support. It's just a tough Congress to get any kind of extra revenue through in this context, but there is bipartisan support. So there's hope there. The other place is on the regulatory front. I think that, you talk to people on the left and the right, they agree that in fact we need to have more housing and we need to address those regulatory barriers. And so I think that's helping to expand that conversation. It's taking place mostly at the state and local level. And to Pete's point, the localities ultimately are really important. And there still are, important, I don't want to belittle the NIMBYist concerns that happen there, but there's this expression that says liberalism ends at the driveway. And I think places like Berkeley, California, that have had real difficulties building housing, one of the most liberal places in the country, but it's like, yeah, I like that housing. Oh, wait, here? I'm not so sure about that. But so I think that there is bipartisan support, and I think we have to just make sure that we find ways to see that support carry through to real legislation.
Now, Ethan, we've talked about how much policymakers should be doing about housing, but let's talk about what the federal government's role should be.
I think we should. I think we should.
What should the federal government's role be when it comes to housing affordability, and what is HUD doing to address the problem?
So we're doing a lot, and there's a whole lot to do. First of all, I want to say thank you for having me here, but also for this report, because this is an essential source of unbiased, clear view of what the challenge is. And so, armed with this and past editions of it and a whole lot of other data, the Biden-Harris administration has a housing supply action plan, which uses all of the tools available to us and asks for more because we know we need more. That's already been the consensus on this panel. I will hit just some of the highlights from it that focus on the rental housing. At the start of the administration, we restarted the Federal Financing Bank Risk Sharing Initiative, which is a way to allow our state and local housing finance agency partners to access really low-cost capital. That's already deployed $1.9 billion. And we're working to extend it, even as we're working to get Ginnie Mae to securitize those loans and provide even more access to capital. We have our rental assistance demonstration, which over its roughly 10 years has deployed huge amounts of capital, roughly $19 billion. And that's just the construction improvements. That's not counting the soft costs or all of the fees that go in. That's actual dollars to preserve older housing, most of it public housing, not all of it. And at the same time, help it meet higher quality standards, higher environmental standards. We have taken steps with our FHA multifamily mortgage insurance to make it work better with the low-income housing tax credit program, and I'm excited to see potential for expanding the credit and making it easier to use. We've taken a number of steps with what we call our LIHTC pilot. It's been around a few years, but it helps make the credits work more easily with FHA mortgage insurance. We also raised our large loan limit for FHA so that the increasingly higher cost deals, larger loans, can get normal underwriting and move through the process more expeditiously. And we indexed it so that we don't have to do a bunch of regulatory hurdles just to raise that limit every few years. And it can work on a more normal basis. We'll probably talk about it in a minute, but we're using funds from the Inflation Reduction Act to make our housing healthier and safer and more energy efficient. So working on the climate crisis, even as we work on the housing crisis. But there are still huge challenges. One of the things I value about this report is it shows us the impact of the enduring patterns of segregation, the enduring cost challenges that are getting worse. And we see it in cost, we see it in quality, we see it in availability, and we see it in the people who are left out. And those people are part of our community in all sorts of ways. But we need to make sure that there are safe, affordable, inclusive homes for all. That's our mission at HUD, and that's what we're focused on. So part of our housing supply action plan is also to ask for more resources. We're doing what we can. We're working on some of the exclusionary housing challenges through our pro-housing initiative, the Pathways to Removing Obstacles, one of the better acronyms here at HUD that my colleagues in community planning and development are doing. We've asked for, in the president's budget proposal, more rental assistance, because part of the reason only 1 in 4 eligible households get it is because we haven't increased the amount available. It's not an entitlement, right? Social Security is an entitlement, Medicare is an entitlement. Housing assistance ain't, it's a lottery, and it shouldn't be. So we've asked for more on the project-based side, more on the voucher side that moves with households, and we've asked for more funds to invest in the properties that already exist. Because part of housing supply is preserving what we have. And we've already mentioned preservation, but I want to mention it again, because it is one of the most powerful things we can do. We have great rental buildings in the hearts of our cities, right near transit. There is a bunch of energy already embedded in those buildings. So if we sustain them and improve them so that the housing quality keeps up with the need, that will help us even as we are adding more supply.
You know, Jacqueline, I want to put this question to you. You know, Ethan had talked about kind of the people who are left out, but we kind of found housing, people are left out intentionally, or it's been designed that way. But climate change is one thing that is affecting people and where they live. There's a part of the report that 41% of the nation's rental stock, 18.2 million units, is located in areas where they're at risk for weather and climate events. This is disproportionately affecting communities of color. In what ways, but also what are the remedies to a problem that is kind of systemic and disproportionate in its effect?
I think maybe a decade ago, people weren't talking about climate resilience and green when it talks about affordable housing. All the practitioners in this industry across the country are talking about climate resilience and greening their buildings, because it's not if the storm will come, but when. From, you know, Hurricane Maria to the fires we had in Maui, we know they're coming, and that we need to design housing to make sure it can be as resilient as possible. And we need to invest in that. And we talk about people of color being impacted by it. Everybody's being impacted by resilience, and people of color disproportionately impacted because of how land use policies, how we concentrate poverty, where we build affordable housing, and how it's paid for. And I think there are ways to do that. Partnerships with HUD. You said resources, you said it first.
Oh,
So
yes.
I will talk about the Community Development Grant and disaster recovery resources. We need to remove the red tape, let that move faster, because the disasters are coming and we need to figure out how we help people get back on their feet. And if you're low income, you don't have resources in the bank to get on your feet. You need government resources to recover. And so I think greater intentionality of how that money flows, dedicating resources to that should be a practice for the federal government. And I would say we would promote it that way.
Chris, what should the focus be when we think about climate resilient housing policies? Where do we start and how do we kind of tackle that intersection? Because we know obviously it's not just the physical structure that's being upended, but it's also just your way of life. You don't have a home, your entire life is kind of swept. So where was that policy? How can policy maybe attack the heart of these issues?
Yeah, I think Jacqueline touched on it, but I think, one thing I would say is that in terms of thinking about climate change and impact on housing, we have a very reactive policy, right? So mostly what we're talking about is the disaster happened and how do we spend money to clean up afterwards? And we need to have a policy that says the disaster's coming, how do we make sure that the damage doesn't happen in the first place? So we talk about adaptation and mitigation in climate change. Mitigation means decarbonizing the housing stock. We're doing work on that. We need to do a whole lot of work on that, but we need to do more on the adaptation. What does that mean? It means where are the utilities located in that structure? Do they need to be moved to the roof? Do we need to think about ways of making the building more waterproof from floods and the like? Do we need to think about wind resistance and how do we make those investments? Rental housing has also been difficult, and a lot of our disaster response has been geared towards homeowners, people coming in and applying for relief. And in the past, rental housing has had a hard time accessing those funds. So I think we have to make sure that when we do have these programs too, we have to think about an equity approach in terms of who is getting access to that funds. And not just is it rental housing, but is it all classes of rental housing? A lot of rental housing is in small buildings, 2 and 4 unit structures. These are not big, sophisticated landlords. How do you reach those folks? So I think that's a big piece of it, is having an adaptation mentality, an equity mentality, and thinking about it with a rental market lens.
One of the things, admittedly, the part of the thing of journalists is knowing that you don't know stuff. I don't know much about insurance premiums, admittedly, but Peter does. So we know that it's having an effect on the housing market. Can you kind of give us what options are available to rein in these insurance premiums from impacting affordable housing?
Sure. So I mean, first of all, insurance premiums have gone up a staggering amount. I mean, we see, in some places as much as 30 or 40%, right? And when I think of insurance, I think of risk, right? And when I think of risk, I think of risk sharing. So what do I mean by that? When you have an affordable housing building, right, you've got a limited amount of income, right? Think of it in the most simplistic way. And you've underwritten to a cost structure. And when one of your costs go up 40 or 50% like that, you can't increase the rental income, right? Because if that's the whole idea of it being affordable, right, to meet the AMI. So, it is disproportionately impacting affordable units. There's also some views out there that, in some ways maybe is affordable housing being viewed as a riskier investment, and whether that is actually true or not, and whether they're being disproportionately impacted that way. So, more to come on that, and others might talk a little bit more about that. But I think we're definitely seeing borrowers trying to find ways to decrease their insurance costs, right? Which just means like less coverage, right? Less term, right? And that's not a good thing either, right? Because we are seeing more big events occur, so you need the coverage, but it's a real problem. And I don't know necessarily how you fix it, right? I'm not an insurance expert in that way. I'm not an actuary, but like I do think that we need to rethink the whole insurance industry, especially as it relates to housing. Maybe it's even something where there's risk sharing done at a state level and a local level and with the for-profits, right? Maybe they provide captives at a local level for, affordable units. But there's got to be a way, because right now you can't take 25 to 30% increases and do that at a run rate. It just doesn't work. It's untenable.
Some of our affordable housing providers have claimed 2, 3, 4 times the rates going up.
Wow.
And so if you think about that, they can't pass that along to the low income renters, or if it's a permanent supportive housing project, they have to figure out how to absorb it. And so we've been exploring, like, what can we do at the state about backstops, federal backstops, ways to share that risk. You can't sustain that because we haven't even talked about utility cost and other things that could be triggering that, or other areas of focus where they've talked about the clientele that lives in a particular building and rates are increased by that. There are so many ways, but we must get our arms around it because our partners are stressing financially, like you said, because of rising expenses.
We're hearing loud and clear
Yeah.
about insurance, have been for
Yes.
quite some time, and have focused the efforts of the department on finding ways to help and adapt, recognizing that most insurance regulations happens at the state level. It's your state
Yes.
insurance commissioner
Yes.
that controls those insurance companies. So one of the things we did, and I see some of my colleagues from policy development and research in the audience, they helped us revisit our operating cost adjustment factor formula, which is a mouthful. But that's how we increase the rental payments to a lot of our assisted properties over time. We changed it to a measure that better reflects property casualty insurance as opposed to a broader insurance measure, which captures some of this increase. It's a small change. It has some contribution to why those OCAF increases have been a little healthier, but it's by no means a solution to the whole problem. We're also hard at work, and probably will release soon, an update to our wind and named storm coverage requirements for FHA insurance. That should provide some more consistency to deal with the limited availability of that coverage. But those are small changes. They're important. We have a task force looking department-wide for all of the tools available to us, and we'll keep taking steps wherever we can. But we need to recognize housing, especially rental housing, only works if insurance is available. Every loan, every equity investment, every renter assumes that a building is insured. And if there is not adequate insurance, the lender's not going to make the loan, the equity investor's not going to put the money in there, and the whole house of cards gets real shaky. So we need to have reliable, adequate insurance coverage in order for housing to meet the demand that we've all been talking about.
Couldn't agree more, Ethan. And I also think what's concerning too is that if the insurance premiums continue to go up, and what, from a lender's perspective, what's happening with the necessary improvements right in the building? There's got to be cutting back elsewhere, and so you start to worry, like, is the necessary work not being done in the lobbies, the boiler systems? Are those things being delayed? And then your collateral starts to deteriorate, right? And I think that that's not only a focus for the banks, but frankly, I think the GSEs are also very focused on physical inspections and making sure that the properties are being maintained.
And this comes back to the resilience point that Chris and Robbie had brought up, and that Jacqueline talked about too, that we need to make sure that our structures are safer and are able to withstand those events that we know are more frequent and more severe as a result of climate change. One of the things that I have personally been most excited about from the Inflation Reduction Act was that it allocated $1 billion to HUD. $1 billion sounds like a lot of money. It's not, but we're making great use of it. It's our Green and Resilient Retrofits program. So the majority of that subsidy is going to retrofits to make buildings both more energy efficient and safer at the same time. It's the first time we've combined those two things in multifamily. We've also created a process, one of the easiest and smoothest processes we've done. Within a year of the law being passed, we had our notice on the street. We have already made almost $300 million in awards, and there's more to come. So if anyone who's watching wants to apply for funds, please go to hud.gov/GRRP and look at the notice. Applications are available. There's been very strong demand for this. And it is one of the ways that we can help lower those costs over time, because when the building has solar panels and or another source of energy generation on site and has reduced its need for energy, folks can stay in their homes, even if the grid goes down sometimes. It can improve the indoor air quality. there are immeasurable, not immeasurable, we're going to measure them, but there are innumerable ways that the improvements matter. The other little piece we're doing with some of the funding for the Inflation Reduction Act is benchmarking our properties to measure what they're doing now in terms of energy use and what they would do after they make improvements. So we have funds available to help properties, whether they participate in GRRP or not, to use the EPA's portfolio manager software, the free software that's available, to track their utility usage. And we used some of the funds to make a direct connection between the EPA system and our asset management system, so that you don't have to email someone a PDF or key in data. You just click the box, because we only do it with permission, and the data flows right in. So over time, we will be able to see portfolio-wide how our assisted properties are saving money and where there are more savings potentially available.
Can I just say one
Of
thing?
course.
The other exciting thing is the GGRF that's in front of us.
Yes.
If that moves ahead, there's opportunities that we've not seen before to invest in improvements.
Do we want to spell the greenhouse
Gas
gas
reduction
reduction fund?
fund? Yes, thank you.
When I said 1 billion isn't a lot of money, it's because the GGRF has many more billions.
2025 or something like that.
Yeah, it has the potential to affect many properties across the country, not just the HUD-assisted
Yes.
properties. And there are tools within the Department of Energy, there are tools within Treasury on the tax side. We're working on an interagency basis to make sure that the puzzle pieces fit together and that the different sources can work in tandem wherever possible to make sure that it reaches as far as it can and as many people as it can.
Thank you, I just thought we should mention it.
What I liked about
Thank
that,
you.
I'm glad we did.
what I liked about that legislation too is it put the money in the hands of those that know how to utilize it, right?
Exactly.
Impact lenders, mission lenders, CDFIs, who are on the ground and know the type of projects that need those funds. And so I actually think that program is going to be very successful.
You know, this something that we've shifted gears. Something that's been said is affordable housing. We've talked about the affordability crisis. But Chris, affordable housing is used kind of as a buzzword to include a variety of different types of income. But what should affordable housing mean for those on the lowest income spectrum? And what does that look like?
Yeah, this is like a whole seminar if we want to do this. Just a quick backup. I mean, I think the question about the term affordable housing, in some respects, my understanding of this is that if you go back in time, we talked about subsidized housing. And then that became a bad word. It's like, oh, subsidized housing, that's where those people live. And so we said, no, let's call it affordable housing. Who's against that? But then we started talking about affordable housing, like housing that's affordable to a broad range of people. So now when you say affordable housing, you got to say something like, no, I'm talking about capital A affordable housing. So first of all, I mean, housing is not inherently affordable without in reference to someone. And so I think, when you're asking this question, I think we're talking about very low income people. We're talking about housing that's ultimately going to need some sort of subsidy. How do we think about what that should be? I thought, Whitney's presentation talking about residual income is a really important concept. Because if you think about it, we have this 30% of income housing standard, right? Housing shouldn't cost more than 30% of income. Well, why is that, right? Where did that come from? And we don't often stop and ask that question, but where it comes from is old studies that found the old aphorism was a week's wages for a month's rent. And the notion was if you did that, then you had enough left over for everything else, right? Well, having enough left over for everything else depends on how much money you're making. And so when the Whitney's chart shows that for people at the lower end of the income distribution have $400 a month left over after everything else, then even the 30% income standard is probably not restrictive enough. So we need to think more about what are we trying to accomplish? If we're trying to accomplish that people have enough money after keeping a decent roof over their head to pay for everything else, we got to rethink that standard to some extent. For some people, it'll be less. But as we're also looking at a problem of affordability, moving up the income ladder, if we're going to subsidize housing up the income ladder, maybe we should think about shallower subsidies, right? And that what we're just trying to do is make it attainable, but we don't have to make it as deeply affordable. So, it makes it really complex. I mean, my friends, I was thinking, wait, you're going to change the income standard? No, okay.
I embrace complexity, but I'm glad you connected it to the history of the thinking, because you're right. Affordable housing was supposed to be the palatable term. I've heard a bunch of others. One of the things I've learned in more than 20 years in this business is there are no magic words. There are a lot of folks in this country who hear some form of government involvement or subsidy and think, okay, I want to keep that out of my community. And that is rooted in where you started the conversation, in long-term patterns of segregation in this country. We need to get past that, and magic words aren't going to do it. What we need to do is invest the resources. And some of that comes through changing policy. Some of it from actually writing checks, because it turns out housing works when the rent gets paid. And for what we have seen in our research and throughout the field in research, the single most effective intervention we have is rental assistance, whether it's attached to the apartment or whether it's something the household carries with them. If you have that federal source, generally federal, there are some state examples, where you pay 30% of your income and the subsidy source pays the rest, housing works because it has enough money to operate and the household has enough room to breathe. So when we're thinking about the change that's needed, it has to come back to paying the rent one way or another.
I'm not sure how much time we have, but the one thing I do want to address is.
We got time.
Okay, we got time. One thing I do want to address is homelessness, and I think it's very important to talk about those who are without. Jacqueline, as pandemic era protections and financial supports are expired or winding down, whatever last stretches there are, we're seeing homelessness rise once again. A common solution to homelessness has been permanent supportive housing. Despite opposition from local residents, as you've mentioned in kind of board meetings, NIMBYism, what are the forces that have let's maybe talk about the importance of permanent supportive housing, but also what forces have maybe prevented it from being used to its best ability to help those who are unhoused?
Well, before we get to that, if somebody only has $400 left, don't you think the homeless count would go up?
Yeah.
If that's all they have left, everybody's on the brink of, falling into homelessness. And I think some of the solutions are around making sure that we all recognize, you talked about like housing has become an issue for all of us and it's visible now. And I think that it's a hint that we also have a moral crisis and we have a housing that's not meeting the needs of people in this country, and that we have to do something about it. And permanent supportive housing is a solution because people need somewhere to sleep at night. They're using tents or using the sidewalk as their bed, that we need to make different decisions for people all across this country to make sure to have 600,000+ people experiencing homelessness is a disaster. We need to move them from the streets, shelters, to permanent supportive housing, meaning they have a stable place to sleep at night and the services they need to help themselves and to improve what's happening to them. I also feel like we were talking about the production of permanent supportive housing. You hear mayors and governors talk about building more housing. You actually need to preserve what we have, because some of this housing, as you were saying, is really old. You need to invest in the systems. You need to invest in the general structure. And that if we want to make sure that we stabilize all of the units that we have, we also have to be willing to invest in affordable housing and preserve what we have. And so as we look to solve homelessness, there's no shortcuts.
One thing that's happening in New York that's interesting is how do you make it financeable? So the city of New York has, through the Department of Health and Services, they'll enter into a long-term lease. And that lease is financeable, right? Because effectively it's an appropriation credit of the city of New York. And we're seeing that really drive some more permanent supportive housing in New York. So I think it comes down to some innovation too.
And all of the permanent supportive housing that I have seen depends one way or another on rental assistance, because you're serving a clientele that for the most part has very little income. So there needs to be, to the Pete's financing point, you need to know there's a way that the rent's going to get paid.
Yeah, and just one other thing I'd add there is, permanent supportive housing is often an important element of what's called a housing first model, right?
Yeah.
And the notion is that people who are struggling with various issues, in the past it says, solve your issues and then you'll be rewarded with housing. But it's a chicken and the egg problem. You can't solve those issues if you're living on the streets. Yeah. So you need to get people into permanent supportive housing. And the supportive part is to say, that people have mental health issues, they have substance abuse issues, they have other issues in their life that they have to deal with in order to get back on their feet. And I think what's really important is to note that it's housing first and not housing only. Yes. And I think oftentimes what we talk about is rental subsidies, but we need to make sure that those supportive services get funded as well. The other thing is that, these are people who have had challenges. And I do want to call out that there was some really high profile failures of public supportive housing in California. The Skid Row Housing Trust, a very well run organization, ran into some serious financial difficulties, because when you're going to house people who have been living on the streets for a while, you have to expect it's not going to go smoothly for everybody. So we got to talk about funding maintenance reserves and other parts of this puzzle. So it's housing first, but it's not housing only. So I think, one of the things I'd say is, as much as we support this housing, we got to give it the support it needs to be successful in the long run.
And a lot of that support, but a lot of that support comes also in community-based services, because you're right, people's needs really vary, and they need to be able to choose what help they get. And it's, if you have a roof over your head and you have a safe place to stay, yeah, you can go do the counseling, and you can go do the employment training, or whatever things you need to get back on your feet. Those need to be available in communities, and that there's a host of funding sources that need to connect to it and integrate so that the housing can run and operate as housing, and entities that are doing the permanent supportive housing and helping to connect people to services have the funds to do that, but also that the community is helping as part of it. So sorry.
Yeah, no, I was just going to say, homelessness is solvable. There's good examples. We saw the 100 nonprofits in Houston. We saw Minneapolis reduce homelessness since 2021. That went down 36%. We know what to do. We need to allocate the resources and do it. And then we need to lift those models up and carry them into other footprints, because I think this is really a solvable problem.
Talk about kind of programs and assistance that help people attain housing. One of them is Section 8 housing vouchers. There are, some states have passed source of discrimination laws that, to prevent people who have vouchers from being discriminated from accessing housing. But there's been a problem with enforcement of them. And there's also these kind of onerous wait lists. People have, I've talked to someone who's waited like 3 or 4 years.
Yeah.
Jacqueline, what can be done better to not only ensure that these wait lists aren't so long, but because we know that there's obviously a huge demand, but also that those with vouchers aren't being discriminated against, that there's actual enforcement to some of these sorts of discrimination laws?
Well, first of all, my home state, California and New York, have done a good job of putting bans. We need a national ban on source of kind of discrimination, because ultimately landlords should be enthusiastic to get guaranteed rent every month. And why are you discriminating against people because it came from the government? It's actually a greater guarantee that you're actually going to be paid. So I think that we need to really do some enforcement, because you can't really hold landlords and housing providers accountable if you don't have a way to enforce it. So I think it's essential that while we do the ban, because I'm a huge advocate about that, is that we have enforcement and we encourage other people to do it, especially if you don't want to see people experiencing homelessness. It's another way to encourage a stability in communities.
I would just, I do think it's also important to take a landlord perspective here to some degree.
Yeah.
And, working with the voucher program ain't easy, right? And
Yes,
so
that's fair.
King County had a really interesting program where they were looking at counseling to try to help people move to areas of opportunity. And they had people who were going to intercede between the housing authority, the landlord, and the tenant. And one of the things they found was that landlords, one of the things they found was it wasn't necessarily the landlords wanted to discriminate, is they want to fill their apartment. And if a landlord had an apartment to fill, they were willing to work with the program. But then they had to have an inspection done.
Yes.
And those inspections don't necessarily follow the same script. And it might be that one inspector says you have to have a shower curtain, otherwise you're not going to pass, right? And then that comes up, and the landlord wants to get the apartment filled, and they can't get somebody on the phone. And so, the King County, this was Opportunity Insights, Raj Chetty's organization, worked with them, found that you needed to have somebody to help be that go-between. So I think we also have to think about ways in which we can grease the skids to make it easier.
Remove the bottlenecks. I couldn't remove it. HUD was doing some work and talking to practitioners, trying to sort through what the challenges are with the bottlenecks. And some of the things we did during the pandemic, where they maybe do a FaceTime call or do a call, video inspection, maybe keeping that up.
Well, and in fact, we are working and have made some real changes.
Good.
I love the program. It's one of our worst acronyms. It's NSPIRE, the National Standard for the Physical Inspection of Real Estate. It's missing a vowel. We know funding's tight everywhere. But it's made some major improvements. One of the things it did was align our inspection standards, also updated them after 20 years, across the project-based, the public housing, and the voucher program. So HUD housing is HUD housing is HUD housing. It all has to meet that same quality standard. That clarity makes it a lot easier for landlords to work with us, for public housing authorities to implement it, to have the inspections happen more quickly, and also that it recognizes the change in real estate over time. So it's all part of our commitment, and hopefully our shared national commitment, that no one should live in squalor, that housing should meet a basic quality standard. And yes, we need to, even as we think about meeting the housing need, understand that it is a business to meet housing needs. And we need to make it a business that people want to do and can do effectively, because that's how we do it. Most of the housing in this country has a bunch of private sector involvement in one way or another. It also has either a little or a lot of government involvement. Even the single family home that you own with a mortgage has some government support in that mortgage interest deduction. It has some government oversight to make sure your deed is secure and your land is secure. You're paying some taxes. There's some it's all a public-private partnership.
Well, you wouldn't have a 30-year mortgage either without
Exactly.
the HGSE, so.
Exactly. So we need to make sure it all works together.
One thing that was that's been abundantly clear, and not just reporting housing, but Whitney laid out in all those slides, is that housing is a multi-layered issue. There's so many issues with housing going on. So it sounds like one of the ways it's going to help is innovation. Ethan,
We're actually.
oh, we're out of time. Oh.
No more innovation.
We're done. Sorry, apologies.
I'm sorry, I don't mean to pull the plug in.
We could talk for hours.
Yes.
we really could talk for hours about this report. The sign off here. Oh, we can also keep chatting about this report for hours, but we're out of time. So I want to thank Chris and his team for this report, and our panelists for joining us today. Let's give them a round of applause, please.
Great job.
All right. Well, thank you, Robbie. That was terrific. And thank you, Jacqueline, Pete, and Ethan. Really wonderful panel. So we have one more element to our event today. I'm really honored to have with us Neera Tandon, Director of the Domestic Policy Council of the White House. Prior to taking this role, Neera was a senior advisor to President Biden. She also served in both the Obama and Clinton administrations and was the president and CEO of the Center for American Progress. Neera is going to speak for a few minutes, and then she and I will sit down for a little Q&A. So Neera, welcome. It's wonderful to have you.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Chris. And I was glad to hear a bit of the earlier panel. I really appreciate the great work of the Joint Center for Housing Studies for inviting me to here today, and for just the critical work you do on analyzing our rental market and understanding housing needs across the country. I'd also like to thank Lot Diaz and Unidos US for hosting the event. It's been a while since I've been at Unidos, and the offices look fabulous. So I would just like to start off by saying it was the president's third year anniversary on Saturday. We've been in the administration for 3 years. And I think this is an important time to take stock of what we've done as an administration and also the impact it's had. Because we know that we have had a lot of impact from our work, but also that the challenge is significant and in some ways growing. So I want to be clear-eyed in taking stock about where we are. As we all know, the president took office in the midst of a just true once in a generation economic crisis. But I think we learned really important lessons during that crisis. Of course, we had the worst housing shortfalls in our nation's history, and it created an unprecedented rent burden. And those challenges preceded the pandemic, but they were obviously accelerated during the pandemic. Homelessness before the Biden administration was increasing during every year of the prior administration. And we also did see some significant increases even under, during the Obama administration itself, although they did a lot of work to address it. So housing has been a top concern for us from day one. Obviously, people have understood the real threat during the pandemic. And so in terms of the legislation we put forward, the Biden-Harris administration deployed over 11 million emergency rental assistance payments and pursued ambitious mortgage forbearance policies. We developed the first national eviction prevention infrastructure. And President Biden, of course, signed into law the American Rescue Plan, the largest single investment in ending homelessness in US history, and really provided incredible support to the housing market. These policies helped 10 million renters remain housed during a deep, deep fiscal crisis. That is why homelessness remained flat between 2020 and 2022, and rather than dramatically increasing during the pandemic. So we know that that really had impact, that our investments, the investments we made, were able to keep people housed. And I think one of our challenges has been the end of those supports, and we have to understand that the end of those supports is having a deep impact. So after the crisis, we've gotten to work to expand the housing market itself. More than 400,000 multifamily units were completed in the third quarter of 2023, the highest number since 1988. A record 1 million units are under construction now. We know that will pay incredible dividends, but we also know and appreciate the work that rents are too damn high. The rent is simply too damn high in the country, and we need a strategy and partners in Congress to ensure that we're building even more for affordability in the housing market. So this is what we learned from the pandemic, and I appreciate the comments in the prior panel, is that concerted government action can actually impact the housing market and provide housing security to millions of people. We cannot expect that we'll have that level of investment always, but we know actually government working with the private sector, creating rules of the road, will stabilize our housing market and provide enough support to people. So I think that's a critical lesson for all of us going forward. And that's how we're thinking about these issues as we try to address these issues and as we chart a path forward. So during our administration, the president released the first of its kind housing supply action plan. Under this strategy, we've been driving actions to boost the supply of affordable housing from agencies across the administration. We've given state and local officials more flexibility in how they use American Rescue Plan funds. And now officials can use critical funds for housing infrastructure, including supporting the conversion of office buildings and other commercial properties into housing. Next, we're not only encouraging communities to build affordable housing, we're incentivizing it. Communities that enact land use and zoning reforms designed to boost housing supply will be more likely to secure infrastructure and other federal funding. So far, we've embedded incentives like these into about $10 billion in transportation funding. So this is a really important pot of funding that I hope that we really want to evangelize localities to take advantage of. In October, we announced a suite of resources to promote the conversion of commercial properties in residential use and housing near transit. For example, the Department of Transportation is providing $35 billion in lending capacity at below market interest rates for this purpose. Given many commercial projects are close to transit, this will be a critical resource to make conversion projects viable. And of course, as we all know, it's vital to have housing near transit because it just makes it much easier for people to access jobs. Third, we're using our grant-making levers. For example, we are standing up new pathways to removing obstacles to housing grant programs to support communities across the country in identifying and removing barriers to housing production. Additionally, we're continuing to promote fairness in our rental market, protecting renters from housing instability and homelessness. That's why we released the blueprint for a renter's bill of rights, which outlines principles to protect renters from rental application process through potential eviction. We announced 24 agency actions to support these principles. For example, we now require 30 days notice prior to evicting a tenant in housing funded by the Department of Housing and Urban Development. And the Department of Agriculture is in process of enacting the same rule. And we can't talk about fairness without discussing fair housing. We are currently finalizing a rule that would bolster efforts to affirmatively further fair housing. This would support communities in their efforts to do so and create clear consequences when they are not. Finally, we are laser focused on addressing homelessness in communities across the country. I completely agree that homelessness is a solvable problem. It requires us to do two things, many things, but two important things: create more affordable housing and provide supporting services to people, which in those supportive services, they have to include housing units, supportive housing, and ensuring that people have the services they need when they move into new housing. So cities and states there are models across the country. People talked about Houston. Houston is a great example of a location that has been able to address affordability and also provide services and a continuum of care. They are innovatively thinking about how they allocate resources to people who need it using data and evidence. And it is a strategy where the entire city is very focused on allocating resources efficiently and effectively to people who need them where they are. It is a great model for the country. So essentially, we know that these issues are all connected. We do need to invest in affordable housing. As I said, we have a multi-pronged strategy. But beyond these steps, last year, the Department of Housing and Urban Development provided nearly $500 million in grants to communities to specifically address unsheltered homelessness and homeless encampments. Furthermore, the Center for Medicare and Medicaid Services expanded the set of housing-related services that can be covered under state Medicaid waivers, such as utility assistance, security deposits, and rental applications. This is a significant innovation in the Medicaid program to really think about how it's providing support for housing as part of people's healthcare and well-being. We also launched All Inside, a place-based initiative through which we are working hand in hand with communities across the country to reduce the particular challenge of unsheltered homelessness. So we have an expansive agenda. We also need Congress to act. That's why the president has put housing priorities, as has such incredible investments in housing supply. We continue to urge Congress to pass the budget so we can expand the low-income housing tax credit and take other measures to support the affordable housing market. And we know there's been recent progress and a recent bipartisan progress on investments in LIHTC, which we very much welcome. We're also calling on Congress to expand housing vouchers and take additional actions to ensure that those vouchers are for extremely low-income veterans, that they are basically guaranteed for low-income veterans, youth transitioning out of foster care, two groups that are at risk of homelessness. So we have an expansive agenda. We also see innovation in the states. Governor Moore, the governor of Massachusetts, we're seeing real innovation across the board because I think there is a broad recognition that housing challenges are a challenge for low-income Americans, but affordability overall is a challenge for people in the middle class striving to stay in cities and towns that they've grown up in, but no longer can afford to be in. And that is a core challenge for all of us in the administration. And that is why you'll see in the president's budget significant investments, but also a big focus on ensuring that we understand that all Americans deserve to have a household that's safe, decent, and affordable, and that every single American deserves a roof over their head. That we can't provide economic security until people have housing security. And that is part of what we need to do to finish the job and a core principle for this administration. So with that, I'd like to go into conversation with Chris.
Great.
Thank you.
Thank you. Well, thanks so much for joining us today.
Of course. Thanks for all your great work and leadership.
Well, I appreciate that. So you covered a lot of ground there, and I don't know how much you heard of the panel, but it echoes a lot of the things we talked about. Maybe I'll pick up in reverse order. At the end, you were talking about the things the president's called on Congress to do. Robbie was asking me about reasons for hope. And so you mentioned some bipartisan support. Of the president's agenda, what are the things that you think have the broadest support and the ones that we might have hope that this Congress, which is a tough Congress, might be able to act on?
Well, I think we are very appreciative of the fact that there is funding for LIHTC, low-income housing tax credit, and the bipartisan tax deal. There's important investments in the child tax credit, but I think there's a recognition of that issue and concern. And I'd also say, I think when you look at the governors, that there's a focus across the country. Obviously, there are a lot of Democratic governors who are thinking about affordability issues. Governor Moore, as I mentioned, the governor of Massachusetts. We see, obviously, California has been innovating in different ways. So, but I think the country recognizes that when people are thinking about cost of living, the rise in rent is really deeply challenging. The concern that people have about being able to afford a home. I think we see these as core cost of living issues, and that is why, we have made significant investments. And, I'm not going to outline the budget now, but I expect additional investments as well.
That's great. No, I think we talked a lot about the fact that this is an issue that's become democratized in terms of a pocketbook issue for more and more people. You mentioned what's happening at the state level, and in your remarks, you talked about what you've been doing to try to get state and localities to produce more housing. Just maybe say a bit more about that. What kind of steps are you taking? What are the levers the federal government has to try to get states and localities to open up the spigot to more housing? And which are the ones you think has the most potential?
Well, I think it's interesting how you talked earlier in there was a discussion about public-private partnerships and how the federal government has a role to play. Obviously, there's investments like LIHTC, but with our investments that we're making through the infrastructure law and in the Investing in America agenda, we have another number of investments that we're making across the board, and we are trying to think innovatively of how we can expand the impact of those investments. So, for example, in the CHIPS program, we've been thinking as an administration of how to ensure that the investments we're making go to companies that are providing childcare. So as we're thinking about transit dollars, we're also thinking about how we can incentivize production of units close to transit locations, as I mentioned. And I think the idea there is we know that there's just an incredible ROI, return on investment in housing near transit units, because it's really it's just much easier for people. A big challenge for people is getting to work, getting to places. And so having affordable units near transportation makes a lot of sense. And that's why that's an important program for us. So we're trying to think about really all the levers we can pull. I mean, I kid you not, we sit in meetings where we think about literally every lever we could pull to help incentivize additional housing. But we also know that there are challenges at the local level, and we can just really do a lot with the Billy pulpit to say it is vital that there's more unit production throughout the country. We have a big gap in the number of units versus the demand. That is what is driving these big increases in rent. It is eating, as you're all pointing out, huge amounts of income from people. And I do think high rents are creating the sense of a squeeze that people feel from high costs. And so the best way to address that is the partnership between the federal government, which is we provide resources, innovation. We think of innovative ways that local leaders can do this, but they also have the political will to build more units at a time where that's not always easy, but really vital for addressing the concerns of their residents as well as the country's.
Right. It sounds like, as I think about it, the federal government can have carrots and sticks, and you've been using a lot of carrots. Are there any sticks at your disposal too in this, or are you carrot centric at this point?
You know what's weird about sticks is people don't like to be hit.
Yep.
This is like a challenge with sticks. I really, welcome good ideas of what sticks to use.
Right.
I think we've been exploring a variety of ideas in the stick space. But I think what I think you are actually seeing now is, look, if you look at the state of the state from a variety of governors, I mean, at first this was really a discussion that was in California, but you're seeing it spread around the country, Massachusetts, as I said, Maryland, New York, Illinois. These are places that have acute affordability challenges, but I think you're just seeing a broader understanding that we need to put a lot more resources on the table, and also have a regulatory posture that recognizes that affordability is a critical component. So I think that you'll see more and more action in this space, just because this is such a keen concern of people.
Yeah, absolutely. Another key issue you touched upon a fair amount is homelessness. And, as we wrote this report, I mean, I think it's an issue that is in the headlines of towns across America. We talk about particularly unsheltered homelessness that you see when you walk down the street that really hits people between the eyes. California has been the epicenter for a long time, Portland, Seattle. But now, places that are in the headlines are Phoenix and Denver and Nashville, and places that you didn't think of as having this issue. You talked a lot about things that can be done. You mentioned Houston. So as you look around the country, are there places that you look to say that's a great model and ways that the federal government could try to support and expand?
Yeah, I mean, I think I touched upon this, but just to expand on the Houston model, I mean, obviously, Houston has been building a lot. The affordability in Houston is different than affordability in Phoenix. Phoenix is a great example. Rents have skyrocketed in the last decade. And then you have just a dramatic increase in homelessness. I mean, obviously, these issues are connected. So I think the thing that's innovative about Houston, and one I think that cities can really think through, is, they are investing in housing, but they also have, just a great, essentially, and evidence-based management of the system. They know where people are. They know where how they can deliver services to people. They have a real strategy of getting services to people where they are, and moving people into units, and then providing real resources to those people. I mean, as we know, I think, as said, we can address these problems. We know that cities are getting people off the streets.
Right.
And we've invested a lot of new units for people. The challenge is that there's a cycle to this. It's like we have gotten way more than 600,000 units in the last couple of years, affordable units for very low-income people, for homeless people to move into. But it's just the housing cost that's driving more of this funnel.
Right.
So what you really need is not just the units for people to go into, but affordability and eviction practices, making it like not easy to evict, and so that it's really it's just a lot harder for people to become homeless. That's what we really did during the pandemic. I mean, it's important to remember that we went through this period, we invested a lot of resources, and the United States, which has not had the biggest social safety net in the world in comparison to other countries, was able to keep people basically out of homelessness for a few years there, out of real in-government investment. So that's a lesson for all of us. But I also think it means concerted action will work to address this problem.
Yeah, I mean, that record is a real lesson to say. I mean, first thing I think we learned during the pandemic was how important home is. Suddenly we all realized that the stability of a place to live and lay your head at night was so important. And as you said,
even if you got sick of it being in there for a while, but yes,
that's right.
It was very important.
But what we did, we found ways to make sure we kept people stably housed during a really challenging time. we're pretty much out of time, but I will say I want to end on a positive note. So I don't know if you know this, that our nickname is the Joint Center for Gloom and Doom. So we have this meeting.
It's like literally started leaking. As you said, gloom and doom.
Well,
I just wanted the record to note it started with what you said, and that was what I said.
Well, let's see if you can part the Red Seas. But so I just wanted to give you a chance to end us on a positive note. And so as we look ahead, these are challenging issues. So what's a good reason for optimism we should have that we as a country can tackle these issues?
I'd say, I mean, just the last point, which is, I think there's often a fatalism in our politics and policy, and we hear a lot of people say that, for example, homelessness is a product of problems with people, and it's not like government policy can actually do anything. And again, I think we learned a very instructive lesson, which is during the pandemic, when we put a lot of resources in, we were able to ensure that people we didn't have a huge rise in homelessness. In fact, it stabilized at a very challenging time. But I'd say my overall sense of optimism really derives from the fact that I think you're seeing a greater consensus around issues. Some issues that have been really difficult to tackle, like land use. Leaders are stepping up in various places to actually try to address them. There's a lot of work to do. I've been in Los Angeles, and I've been in meetings on homelessness where people tell me that we need to address homelessness, but we can't build more apartments, which, I think that's an incongruent idea. But you're seeing a lot of leaders step up and say, as I said, governors, city leaders, really try to address affordability head on. Because truly, I think of this issue as where health insurance was 10, 15 years ago, 10, 15 years ago when I was working on the Affordable Care Act, if you'll let me diverge for a second. In the early 2010s, we started working on it, 2008, 2009, 2010, there's a big discussion about how premiums were rising dramatically in the country, which they were. And we passed the Affordable Care Act, and that actually stabilized. We took a lot of innovations we created a lot of innovations to create downward pressure. But also, people just couldn't really afford it anymore. And I think we're at that same cusp in the national discussion where people understand the rents are just going so high, we can't address it. So that's why you're seeing more and more bipartisan activity. I'm super excited about that. And I feel like someone needs to do something about this. So we might want to end it on that
I think we'll end it on
note.
that. So Jamir, thank you for being here. Thank you for the work the Biden administration is doing on housing. Housing people talk a lot about trying to get the attention of the highest levels of government on housing, and I think we have it. So I wish you well in all these endeavors.
I just have to say one more thing, which is Vincent Arena is here with me, who's been leading our work with Chad Maisel, who are both fantastic leaders on this issue at the Domestic Policy Council. And this is Vincent's second to last day. So he gets a lot of credit for the great work we've done. So thank you.
Thank you, Vincent. I want to thank Robbie and the panelists for a great conversation. Thank Whitney and Sophia and my colleagues at the Joint Center for a great report. Thank Wells Fargo for making this all possible. Unidos for being a wonderful host. The weather notwithstanding. And thank all of you for coming in your interest in this. And go to our website, jchs.harvard.edu, download the report. We hope that this is the beginning of a conversation to work on these issues. And so go forth and do good work, and thank you all.
Thank you so much.
That was terrific.